Alright folks, today I've got two swords from LK Chen to review. The Royal Arsenal Infantry Dao and the Heavenly Horse Cavalry Dao. The earliest archaeological find of a ring pommel Dao is from 113 BCE. At that time the Jian dominated the battlefield, but at the end of the Western Han Dynasty, the use of the Dao increased. This type of sword is very efficient to mass produce and equip soldiers with. The single-edged blade is quicker and easier to make than a double-edged one, and the ring pommel is directly attached to the tang. This one is soldered on, so that doesn't require a whole lot of work either. And there's no guard. So these you can just basically crank out in large numbers to ready an army. And the thick spine also makes it potentially more robust than a Jian. If you compare the two side by side. Over time, the Dao slowly replaced the Jian on the battlefield. You have an arsenal ledger from the year 13 BCE where you have the short weapons listed, and 2/5 of them were Jian and 3/5 were Dao. Both of these have pattern welded blades made of 1065 high carbon steel and T8 tool steel. And from my tests so far, it seems that it is very high quality steel. The scabbards are made of ebony. The grips are wood with silk wrapping, and the fittings are brass. These are astonishingly light, especially the infantry Dao. The original weighed 481 grams, or almost exactly a pound, and this here is the same. So that is literally the lightest sword of that length that I've ever handled. It's just crazy light. This feels like nothing. Even with just the wrist, you can easily move this around. Just give me a moment. I'll talk about that later. So even with just the wrist, you can very easily move this around. And of course, if you engage your body along with it, you can do some pretty powerful cuts. So this is very, very agile. The Cavalry Dao is also exceptionally light for its length. It weighs more overall, of course, but it's a very long blade. As you can tell, it barely fits in frame. And this has, of course, quite a bit more heft. It's still maneuverable, but not as nimble as the Infantry Dao, of course. I mean, you would use this from horseback. You would have to be able to reach infantry on the ground. So as far as the cutting performance is concerned, they both do well. However, I can definitely feel the lightweight on this one. It's fast, but it just doesn't have a lot of mass. So you need to really kind of drive it through with a bit more force to really cut all the way. The edge is perfectly good. It's sharp and cuts well, but it's not quite as sharp as on the Jian that I've tried before. And same on the other one. I have to say I find it hard to imagine using such a light sword against even a lightly armored opponent, textile armor, things like that. I don't think it would be very easy to cut through that because of the minimal mass. And using it against a helmet, I think you could probably pretty much tank a strike like that. It wouldn't really have a lot of percussive force. Especially considering that thrusts are usually the best bet against armor, both against soft armor, because it's more likely to penetrate deeply than a cut, and also against heavy armor, because then you can exploit gaps. That's not really much of an option here. I mean, I tried it because I was curious, and thrusts on a ballistic gel dummy worked very well. In fact, even better than I would have expected. The only problem is, well, you don't have a guard. And this almost turned ugly at one point. Oh boy. That was a close call. I just noticed it in time and I was slipping up and immediately opened my fingers. There's really nothing stopping your hand from riding upward as you thrust, and it encounters resistance. So, I mean, sure, you can try to hold onto it extra tightly, but, you know, especially if it gets wet and slippery, that just wouldn't really work. So, personally, I wouldn't really want to thrust with this consistently without heavy gloves, at least. Oh, damn. That was a nice cut. Went deep. Mostly the pipe, it cut off a sliver of the wood. With these hard hits, it's doing very well. I don't feel a whole lot of hand shock, and it seems very solid. So that's good. And considering that on the battlefield swords would hit armor, shields, other swords, etc., I also wanted to do some hardware testing to see how well it holds up. And overall, it did very well, with the exception of this. That came loose during the use. That's also an issue with the scabbards. They had these brass fittings here, which both fell off. And it was pointed out that this is ebony, which has a high oil content, which can often lead to problems with gluing. Looking at it, there's very, very little glue residue. So I personally think this needs either a different type of glue or simply more, maybe both. And sadly the same happened on the Cavalry dowel as well. I can also just take that bolster off, and on this one it's less of a problem because the bolster is more tightly fitted, so it doesn't want to just fly off when I swing it around. Either way, that's not great. Now of course I understand that differences in climate can be challenging. If a sword comes from a high humidity climate to low humidity or vice versa, things can happen. Wood can crack, things like that. But I do hope there's a way to address this and improve it in the future. So the Heavenly Horse Cavalry dowel is basically the same except longer. A lot longer. I thought I would like that because this is really quite short. I don't though, because this is an extremely flexible blade. Now the good thing is that it's resilient steel, and along with the tempering, which is 58 HRC by the way, you can flex this like absolute insanity and it'll spring right back to true. It doesn't take a set even with that. So that's amazing in terms of steel quality, but it has some issues. I've talked about the problem of overly flexible blades before with regards to rapiers, and now this is not a thrusting sword, obviously, the lack of a guard indicates that, but it's so flexible that it can interfere with a cut. If the edge alignment is just slightly off, this has a tendency to flex in the target and just stop the cut short or limit it, whereas a stiffer blade is more forgiving. This is not a forgiving sword at all. I've managed some really nice cuts with it, very clean and smooth, but I also had a lot that were mediocre or outright terrible. So this is not an easy one to cut with. There's something about it that makes it really hard for me to maintain good edge alignment. Now, of course, edge alignment is primarily user error unless there's something horribly wrong with the grip, which in this case there isn't. So there's that, but as I said, it's not the most forgiving. Either way, so as far as the shape of the grip is concerned, that applies to both of them. This is a very skinny grip. It feels a little blocky. It's basically rectangular, except that it tapers toward the front. Pretty hard corners on this. It's not rounded, so you only have the silk wrap to make that a little softer, so it's not terribly comfortable. It is really thin. Like if you look at this in the side profile, like especially if you have a large hand, this would feel really skinny. I don't, and it still feels very, very small to me. So, but it's based on the original, of course. So that's not really a criticism of this reproduction here, because the original is like that as well. And of course, it makes sense because again, if you want to mass produce swords to equip a large number of soldiers with, you can't make it too fancy. Just slap some simple grips on it, wrap it, done. So overall, what really impresses me about these, aside from the low weight, is the quality of the blades. So the steel is great. The edge is perfectly good. You know, after the tests I've done, both of these did perfectly well. Neither of those blades bend or were damaged in any way. There's also no scratching or anything. So definitely very hard, durable steel. My problem is with the cavalry dowel. It's very flexible, as mentioned. The infantry dowel is perfectly good. It has the right amount of flex. It's fairly stiff, but with some more force, you can flex it pretty well. And again, it shows the nice temper on this one. My issue with this is the theme of mass production for the battlefield seems to be taken a little too far. Because if I look at the details here, especially the Heavenly Horse dowel in its scabbard, you can really see quite the gap there. It doesn't fit perfectly. The end of the wooden handle scales is irregular. You can see one side sticks out a little more. It's longer than the other. This would be a really easy fix, by the way, so I don't know why this was left that way. It seems very rushed. On the Royal Arsenal dowel, it's better. It doesn't stick out like that. The black finish on the ring of the Heavenly Horse dowel wore a lot, so this doesn't seem very durable. I'm also not a fan of how the end of the string on the Royal Arsenal dowel just kind of hangs out there. From what I remember, it was already like that when I got it. Then the scabbard of the Heavenly Horse dowel is actually cracked open. In fact, it seems like there's nothing holding it together other than the fittings on top and bottom. So it just all seems a little sloppy, quite frankly. And I'm really surprised to see that, because the other swords that I have from LK Chen are much better in terms of fit and overall attention to detail. These two, especially the Heavenly Horse dowel, just seems rushed. And that's really a shame. I don't really see why that is compared to the other ones. And that's what makes me a little hesitant to recommend them. I mean, they aren't expensive for swords on the current market. The Royal Arsenal dowel costs $270 and the Heavenly Horse $330, which again, comparatively on the market isn't terribly expensive. But if you then get something that is this sloppy, I don't know about that. Could you argue that it's historically accurate, that mass-produced swords wouldn't have the greatest fit and everything and have flaws? Sure. Is it acceptable on the current sword reproduction market? I don't think so. So even though I like how they handle, and even though the blades are excellent, aside from the flexibility on this one, I would have to say hold off on these until they go through some revisions and until improved versions are out, which is probably going to happen pretty soon. I've seen them improve swords before, so chances are they'll use this feedback to make them better. And at that point, I would definitely say, yeah, go for them. But for now, there's some flaws. And if you do get to handle one of these, don't try to thrust with them. Your fingers will thank you for not doing so. This is why I like guards. Anyway, so hope you found the review interesting and helpful. Thanks for watching and have a good one, folks. Let me try to double draw these. Aha! Fear me.